Tonight we are discussing the second Berakha before Kiryat Shema. The first Berakha identifies God as the creator of the world, not just one who created in the past, but one who is consistently creating in the present. As we saw, HaMehadesh betuvo bechol yom tamid ma'aseh bereshit. God is consistently renewing creation. In this second Berakha, we are identifying the particular relationship between God and the Jewish people. Whereas the first Berakha is universal, about God as the creator, the second one is about God as our Father, God in relationship to the Jewish people. Now let's look at Harambam inside in this first chapter. Mishneh Torah Echod Kiryat Shema Perek Aleph Halacha Vav, chapter 1, law number 6. Berakha Rishona Shelefaneha Bayom, the first Berakha that you say in the morning is Yoser Or, the former of light. God is the creator of light. In contrast to the Berakha at the nighttime of Ma'ariv Aravim, which is identifying the night, right? So God is still identified as being the creator, but at night discussing the nighttime and the daytime discussing the light. The second Berakha, which is very similar in both, is Ahavat Olam, God's eternal love for the Jewish people. Now, if you've prayed with an Ashkenaz Sidur, you've noted that the morning Berakha does not start Ahavat Olam, but rather Ahavat Rabbah, whereas the night Berakha is Ahavat Olam. We'll discuss this as well within our class and why there is such a variance. But you clearly see here a progression from the first Berakha to the second Berakha. From a universalistic perspective of God as creator, not just the one who created, but the one who's consistently creating and involved within his creations. HaMehadesh betuvo bechol yom tamid ma'aseh bereshit. God is consistently renewing creation. And not just that, God has rahamim. He has mercy on his creations, and he cares for his creations. That is on a universalistic perspective about everything that is created on this earth. It also is very much about developing our understanding of God through his creations. Through his expressions, we come to learn about him. The second paragraph is very particularistic. It's about the relationship between us as Jewish people and God, through what is unique about our relationship, which is the Torah. You could describe it as the love letter between God and the Jewish people. Because calling it the covenant, while true, just seems so cold. When we call him Avinu Sheba Shamayim, our Father in heaven, we have this loving relationship with him. As identified in the opening of this Berakha, Ahavat Olam, eternal love, or Ahavat Rabbah, great love. So let's continue. The first thing that you're going to notice in this Berakha, if you open up your Sidur, is that while we call it a Berakha, it doesn't open up with the formulation of a Berakha. It does not start off Baruch Atah Hashem Eloheinu Melech Haolam, and definitely not as a Berakha v'mitzvah with Asher Kiddushanu v'mitzvotav v'sivanu. It starts off directly with the content of the Berakha. Ahavat Olam Ahavtanu. With eternal love, you have loved us. So how is this still a Berakha? In the next halakha of Harambam, he describes that there are certain Berachot that don't open up with the formulation of Baruch Atah Adonai, Eloheinu Melech Haolam, etc. And that is when they are samuch or simuch, right? They are connected to, they are close with their haver, right? Their friend. So this Berakha is the second of another Berakha that opened and closed with Baruch, and therefore this one, which is next to, its friend does not need to open up with a berakha, but does indeed close with a berakha. So let's look at this berakha. Ahavat olam ahavtanu Adonai Eloheinu. Right? With eternal love, you have loved us. Yud kevavke Eloheinu. Noting the unique relationship that we have with God. Chemla gedula v'tirah hamalta alenu. Right? With how much care, great care, that God has cared for us. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, we also are noting the fact that we see him as our sovereign. We are requesting something of God, which is really interesting. And we're saying that because of your name, your great name, but also because of the relationship that we have continuously from our forefathers who entrusted within you and your Torah and with your laws, and they strove to do your will with a full and complete heart, mind, and soul. Kente honenu avinu, so too you should have mercy and care and grace on us. Av harahaman hamirahem, the one who is so merciful. Please have mercy on us. And what is it that we're really asking for and praying so strongly for? Where we're saying, God, for your own sake, please, for the fact that we have a past relationship with our forefathers who were so loyal to you, because of the fact, God, that you also are so merciful. Please, we beg of you. What do you think continues here? V'ten belibenu bina lehavin lehaskir lishmor lilmod lamed lishmor la'asud kayem ekol devrei tamud toratecha be'ahava. God, we want so badly to have a good relationship with you, to have a relationship with you, to have some understanding of who it is that we have a relationship with, because you cannot have a relationship with somebody unless we have some understanding of them. Otherwise, it's just our imagination. And we want to have a relationship with you. And so thereby, ten belivenu bina le'avin, give us a capability of understanding, to have some understanding of you. The skill, to have some mental grasp. The shmoa, to have some understanding. Lilmod ulamed, right? So that we could learn and to be able to teach. And by the way, the capability of teaching means that you really understand what it is that you've learned, to be able to articulate it to another person. The shmor, but not just that of intellectual understanding, we want to be able to observe it and practice it, which is also transformative of us as human beings. Our behavior changes our mindset. The shmor v'la'asol kayem et kol divrei tamud toratecha be'ahava. We are asking for your help, God, to help us to observe your mitzvot, because we want to upkeep all of that which we have learned within your Torah with great devotion and great love. God, we want to have a relationship with you. And our prayer now in the second Berakha of Shema is for your help, guiding us, opening us up to this relationship that we want so bad. And we're tapping into every resource that we possibly can to develop some knowledge. Please, we want to have some understanding of you, to learn about you. V'ha'er enenu b'toratecha. Enlighten our eyes with your Torah. V'dabek libenu b'mitzvotecha. Allow us to be glued to your mitzvot. V'yahel lebabenu lehaba u'yirat shemecha. We want to become one within our love and our awe of your great name. This is incredible. It's not this assumption, but it's a prayer recognizing that we may not have so much of an understanding right now, that we struggle with our development of our relationship with God. And we're very honest about that. And so we're praying for God to help us to have a relationship with him. It's unbelievable Berakha. And it keeps going. And asking God to not allow us to be embarrassed in our lack of knowledge within this relationship. Right? And we were asking him again, because of your great mercy and going above and beyond that which is required of you, do not ever leave us. Thereby help us in developing and furthering our knowledge of you and relationship with you. And then at the end, we close with asking for redemption. Very quickly, please bring upon us blessings and peace by bringing us from the four corners of the earth, by breaking the yokes of the foreign governments from which we live under. Because really, God, we want to live under you. In God we trust. We want to live under you, God, but really, not under human law, but under God's law. With you as Melech Malcheha Melachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with you, God, as the King of all kings, we want you to be our sovereign, not other foreign ideas or foreign governments. And so we want to establish Eretz Yisrael as the place where we could create our own culture, which is the one that you taught us, which is a culture that helps us develop knowledge of you. Because we want to have this relationship with you so bad. You have chosen us from all the other nations. And you have brought us close to you with great love. In order to praise and to bring distinction and awe and devotion to your great name. Thereby, everything that we said above, bring us to this understanding of you, allow us to establish Eretz Yisrael under your culture and your law in an environment that we could develop more knowledge of you and more relationship of you. Baruch atah Hashem, habocher be'amo Yisrael be'ahava. God, you are the one who chose us with your great love, and we want to be in that relationship. Please do help us. And then we continue with Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Then we start with the declaration of Kriyat Shema, which is specifically about the unique relationship that we have with God. It's what Moshe Rabbeinu told the Jewish people, listen Yisrael, my nation. Yud Ke Vav Ke, the Tetragrammaton, the unique knowledge that we have of God, we have taken on as our sovereign, as our king, and we understand that this Yud Ke Vav Ke is absolutely unique within his uniqueness, and there's nothing else like him. And I think what the Midrash was trying to get across by framing this between Yaakov and his sons is that we are recognizing that this is continuing the legacy of that special relationship that God had with Abraham, with Yitzhak, and with Yaakov. Beautiful Berakha, particularly about our relationship with God. Now I'd like to address the difference between Ahavat Olam and Ahavat Rabbah and where that comes from. It's from the Babylonian Talmud, Talmud Bavli, Masechet Berachot, Daf Yod Aleph. And here there's a conversation about the formulation, the structure, the content of the second Berakha of Shema. Amar Yehuda, Amar Shemuel, Ahavat Rabbah. Very clearly so far, the statement is that's Ahavat Rabbah, And in Talmud Bavli, there is a second opinion brought of a teacher teaching his student. What should the formulation be? Ahava Rabbah. Seems very clear. Sephardim, according to this, as we have in the Vilna Shas, should change their second Berakha of Shema from Ahavat Olam to Ahavat Rabbah in the morning. The Talmud of the Vilna edition is very clear. And not only that, Tanyana Me'ache, we have a corroborating Beraita which states, En Omrim Ahavat Olam. You should not cite Ahavat Olam. Ela Ahavat Rabbah, but rather you should say Ahavat Rabbah. The majority opinion is Ahavat Olam. And according to them, and then they say, Ahavat Olam avtich alken v'shachtich hasid. Right? They quote the pasuk, which has the phraseology of Ahavat Olam, which is also talking about the subject of God's love for his people. So very clear, it seems to be that you have here two Amoraic positions, that it's Ahavat Rabbah. You have a Beraita that clearly states that it's not Ahavat Olam, it's Ahavat Rabbah. We do have Rabbanan, a majority opinion, that says Ahavat Olam, and brings a pasuk for that. But clearly the way that this is being read and the way that the Ashkenazim have taken it, it is based on a Gaonic reading, which we'll see in a second, is that it's Ahavat Rabbah and not Ahavat Olam. And so if that's the case, how come Sephardim recite Ahavat Olam in their second Berakha? That's because this edition, the Vilna edition, is not necessarily the correct edition of the Talmud. So, in many manuscripts, and attested in Osar HaGeonim by Rabbeinu Hananel, by the Rishba, and by the Ritba, the text is very different. On the right side, you see this edition. There are slight variances, very slight, between those editions, but they're generally like this. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shemuel, like we had above. Ahavat Rabbah. So again, Shemuel's opinion is that the formulation should be Ahavat Rabbah. But now the Rabbanan is not part of the Beraita, the rabbi's opinion is not part of the Beraita, the general opinion. Rather, that's actually above as a counter to Shemuel. So you have an independent opinion of Shemuel, of Ahavat Rabbah, and then Hachamim, in contrast, a larger majority, Omrim, they disagree, and they say Ahavat Olam, not Ahavat. And now you have the Beraita, Tanya Nameh Hache, a corroborating Beraita to whom? And Omrim, not like we saw before, Ahavat Olam, doesn't say don't say Ahavat Olam, it says don't say Ahavat Rabbah, Ella Ahavat Olam. That's really interesting. And that flows very nicely. Because if you look at the structure here, we have the opinion of Ahavat Rabbah, then we have the counter of Ahavat Rabbah with the Hachamim. That is then corroborated with a Tanaitic source. Excuse me. En Omrim Ahavat Rabbah. Don't say like Shemuel is saying Ahavat Rabbah. Rather say Ahavat Olam. And just like the pasuk in Yirmiyahu states, Ve'ahavat Olam. Very, very smooth and very nice. And so that was the version that the Sephardic communities were looking at. And because of that, you have Rabbeinu Hananel, the Rishba, and the Ritba all saying it should be Ahavat Olam. So often when it's said that, let's say, Harambam or the Geonim or Sephardim are going against the Talmud, we first need to check the text of the Talmud. Is the text of the Talmud the same as what all of these Rishonim were looking at? These Geonim? Or is it not? We're relying particularly on the Vilna printing of Shas, for which there's a very interesting history. but it's not the only printing. And it varies in many cases from the traditional manuscripts that we have had, that you still can find, by the way, online. Multiple websites where you can actually see these manuscripts. But even if not, you could open up the Rishonim and the Geonim and see what text they had, because often it's at variance with the text of the Vilna Shas that we have in front of us. And so before attacking Harambam, the Geonim, the Rishonim, on their understanding of the Talmud, I think first we need to actually take a look at what text of the Talmud they were looking at, what manuscript, and what attestations to that manuscript do we have, and also look at what reads better. And I say the what reads better not because a person should change the text to read better. I think that would be incorrect. And that was practiced in certain communities. But very clearly in other communities, for example, in the Yemenite communities, we know that the manuscripts are unchanged, because even when there was a scenario where they did not understand something within the Talmud or within the text, they did not change the text. And that's why those manuscripts are so pristine. If you look at other manuscripts from other regions, you'll note that there are crossouts, there are writing on top, and often the manuscript will end up changed. We note that within our Vilna Shas, for example, when we look at Rashi, and Rashi says, "V'hachei garsinan," and this is how it should read, meaning Rashi was looking at a different text and saying it should actually be read differently. But when we look at our Vilna Shas, we don't see the text that Rashi was actually looking at, only the text that he said it should be. And so we don't have that original, but only the change. And so I bring this up very long-windedly because I think it's very important to understand. When doing in-depth study, we do have to look at the manuscripts. We do have to look at the Rishonim that quote the manuscripts and understand the text from which they were looking at, and try to understand what the least corrupted text actually states. So here you have Rabbeinu Hananel, it's one of the Geonim. The Hadid Kaman, a little bit further within the Talmud, past where we looked at Berachot Yod Aleph. Amar Yehuda, Amar Shemuel, Ishkim Lekrot Batorah, and he's quoting a different topic that comes up there. And he notes that many look at this sugya that comes up a little bit later, which states Shekebar Niftar Be'ahavar Abba, that one has already fulfilled their obligation with stating the Berakha of Ahavar Abba, not to get into the specifics of the issue there. And thereby, they're going to understand that the Talmud is really trying to deliver the idea that Ahavar Abba is the appropriate text for the second Berakha of Kiryat Shema. But he says, no. Deha Memrad Shemuel. Since that sugya, that section, is working with, it's dealing with specifically a phrase from Shemuel. Shemuel brought up a topic. He made a statement on a specific issue. And since it's dealing with that issue and quoting that issue, it's going to utilize the Shema'ata, the statement of Shemuel. And obviously Shemuel's statement, the Shemuel de Amar Ahavar Abba. He is the one that said Ahavar Abba. And that's why that sugya there is going to say Ahavar Abba. But the Talmud had already dealt with whether it should be Ahavar Abba or Ahavat Olam in Yud Aleph, that we already saw. And according to his opinion, in this later sugya, it is noting, and that's why it states there in the later sugya, Ahavar Abba. But that's not the opinion that we rely on, because it was already rejected by the Hachamim, who have a corroborating Tanaitic Beraita, and so we rejected Shemuel's opinion of Ahavat Rabbah. And this later sugya that says Ahavat Rabbah is only utilizing the language of Shemuel to discuss his issue because we are quoting him at first. So if we're quoting him, it's of course going to say Ahavat Rabbah. Nice argument by Rabbeinu Hananel. But it's not also clear. Rav Amram Gaon, another one of the Geonim, who essentially became the core, one of the cores of our Sidur, who responded to many, many questions of the order of our prayer and the structure of our prayer. This is way before the Sidur was ever constructed. He was the first one of the first to respond to this. And he writes, not that it should be Ahavat Olam, but rather it should be Ahavat Rabbah. Unless you say, one second, Rabbi, the Ashkenazim say, Ahavat Olam in Arbit, right? So this is Ahavat Rabbah in Shaharit, exactly like the Ashkenazim say. Again, here very clearly, Ahavat Rabbah of Shaharit, according to Ram Gaon, and he is exactly like what the Ashkenazim do, where he says Ahavat Olam for Arbit. Ahavat Rabbah for Shaharit, Ahavat Olam for Arbit. So let's continue. Let's look at another Gaon. And when I say Gaon, by the way, it doesn't mean a genius. It means the head of an academy, the head of one of the yeshivot. It's speaking about one of the leading rabbis of a specific time period, right? So we're talking about roughly the year 600 to about 1030. That's the time period of these Geonim, who are heads of academies. For example, Pumbedita, Surah, Nehardea. I note these names here. You could definitely do some Wikipedia searching to learn a little bit more about each of these yeshivot. Some of them still had these same archives from the yeshivot in Bavel, from the time of the Talmud was being ran. Others moved and still had the archives. Others may have not. But these Gaonim are really a continuation from the Talmudic studies themselves. And that's why it's so important to look at the Geonim, and that's why we are looking at Rabbeinu Hananel, Rav Amram Gaon, and now Rav Saadia Gaon. Now, Rav Saadia Gaon here is also listing out the prayer. Okay, and here you'll see that Rav Saadia Gaon doesn't have the articulation as Rav Amram Gaon does, but rather he says, as you see here in the blue, Ahavat Olam. So while it seemed to be so clear from the manuscript, and I did make a very big deal about it, it wasn't so clear amongst the Geonim. And so the Ashkenazim built their Sidur on Rav Amram Gaon, and so they took Ahavat Rabbah, Ahavat Olam, and it's not just based on a faulty manuscript of Talmud. Although I did show you that the manuscript, as seen by the Rishba, and Rabbeinu Hananel, does read much smoother and does very much back up the opinion of Ahavat Olam. And it could still be that Rav Amram Gaon had that girsa, but rather did not understand the Talmud like Rabbeinu Hananel did, and rather saw the later sugya possibly as explaining that it should be Ahavat Rabbah. Not sure, I don't know. I haven't seen that responsa by Rav Amram Gaon. That would be my speculation. There's an amazing footnote here in the book, which has the Sidur of Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon that I'd like to know. And here, this footnote is quoting. I'm going to quote the phrase, V'Rav Shira v'Rav Ha'eh. These are two Geonim. Me'idim. They testify. Sheminhag yeshivatenu, that the custom, what they were accustomed to in their academies, me'olam, for as far back as they could possibly ever remember, ve'ad achshav, and even all the way through till now, she'en omrim el ahavat olam, ben b'shaharit u'ben ba'arvit, that they only say ahavat olam And they don't say Ahavat Rabbah. Regardless of whether it's Shaharit or Arbit, they are only saying Ahavat Olam. אבל למטה מחסיה בסורה בכל בתי מדרשו שלהן אומרים שחרית וערבית אהבת עולם. Now, they're quoting from two of the other yeshivot. Okay? And these two other yeshivot, they note that there are multiple academies within them, in these cities. To be more clear, these are cities and these yeshivot within these cities. Right? Even Pumbedita and Nehardea are cities, and there's major yeshiva in those cities. So now you have Mata Mehasya, one city, and Surah is the second city, each with a major yeshiva and other Batei Midrashot, which are smaller academies, it seems to be. They all say, regardless of whether it's Shaharit or Arbit, whether it's the morning or the night tefillah, they all say Ahavat Olam, except for one Beit Midrash. I think that's fascinating. I think this leads to the real core here, is that there were two traditions. There was this majority opinion of the articulation being Ahavat Olam, and then there was this minority opinion of Ahavat Rabbah, as it notes Midrash Ehad Bilvad. Very interesting. So common practice today, if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, states here, Berakha Sheniya Ahavat Olam, the second Berakha of Kiryat Shema is Ahavat Olam. The Rema note, V'yesh Omrim, there are those who say Ahavat Rabbah, V'chen Noagin Bechol Ashkenaz. And that's what we practice in all of the lands of Ashkenaz. And so you now know almost the entire history, as much as I know, of the difference and the development of Ahavat Olam and Ahavat Rabbah. In either case, though, I think the message of the Berakha remains the same. And it does go all the way back, this dispute, to the Amoraic times within the Talmud, of an opinion of Shemuel, who stated Ahavat Rabbah. Now, while he may have lost that debate, depending on which manuscript you look at, the major meaning is still very much similar. Whether it's eternal love that God has for the Jewish people, which does have certain nuances, or great love for the Jewish people, both preserved amongst the Geonim, Amram Gaon, Ahavat Rabbah, Rav Sadia Gaon, Ahavat Olam, the particular relationship that God has with the Jewish people through his love letter to us, through his covenant, through his document representing our relationship, our ketuvah. And we so much want to be close with him, to understand him, to learn more about him. And so in our second Berakha of Kiryat Shema, we ask for his kindness, for his mercy, for his grace, in opening up our hearts and our minds to allow us to develop our relationship with him further, to learn more about him and gain more understanding. That concludes our class on the second Berakha of Kiryat Shema.